Let me tell you something I genuinely cannot stop thinking about. On the same day, Iran announced it was reopening its airports. 6 of them, including Tehran's Imam Khomeini, Mashhad, Mehrabad, resuming international flights for the first time since this war began. On that exact same day, the Strait of Hormuz remained closed. No ships, no oil tankers, no commercial vessels passing through the most critical waterway on the planet. Flights up, ships blocked, same country, same day. Now I want you to sit with that for a moment. Because that contrast, those two things existing simultaneously, tells you more about Iran's actual negotiating position than any press conference, any state TV broadcast, or any Trump Truth Social post ever could. Iran is not collapsing. Iran is not surrendering. Iran is not retreating. What Iran is doing is something far more strategic, far more deliberate, and frankly far more dangerous than what you are reading in the headlines. And then there's China, sitting quietly, opening its reserves, buying time, named no side, chose no war. Let's talk about what is actually happening here. The sky opens, the sea stays shut when the war started on February 28th, when the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury, nearly 900 strikes in 12 hours, killing Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei in the opening salvo. Iran's first major move was not just missiles, it was the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, and that one action, closing a 34-kilometer stretch of water, triggered the largest oil supply disruption in the history of the modern world. 20% of the world's seaborne oil passes through that strait every single day. Saudi Arabia's oil, UAE's oil, Qatar's LNG, Iraq's exports, all of it, gone overnight. Oil prices, around $60 a barrel at the start of the year, jumped past $100 when markets opened in early March. By April, Brent was touching $95 to $110. 500 million barrels of crude and condensate have been knocked out of the global market since February 28th. The IMF this week warned that global growth will take a hit, not if the ceasefire fails, but even if it holds. That sentence from the IMF is the most underreported thing said about this conflict in the past week. Even with a deal, even with peace, the damage is already done. And Iran planned for this. Iran calculated this. Because here is what most people don't understand about the Hormuz closure. It was not just a military response to being bombed. It was a strategic instrument, a lever, a pressure point designed to force the world to pay attention, force oil prices up, force economic pain on every country that depends on Gulf energy, and create the conditions under which Iran could negotiate from leverage rather than defeat. That is why the airport reopening matters so much. Reopening 6 airports while keeping Hormuz closed is not a mixed signal. It is a very deliberate, very precise signal. It says, we can control exactly how much of this crisis we resolve and exactly when. We can give you just enough relief to keep the diplomacy alive while withholding enough pain to keep you at the table on our terms. That is not the behavior of a country that has been destroyed. That is the behavior of a country that believes it is winning the negotiation. What China actually did. Now, I need to spend real time on China, because China's behavior over the last several weeks is one of the most important and most under-examined stories of this entire conflict. And I want to start with a number, 1.4 billion barrels. That is what multiple analysts estimate China had stockpiled in its strategic petroleum reserve by early 2026. Roughly 120 days of seaborne import cover at normal consumption levels, according to a senior crude analyst at KPLR, one of the most respected commodity tracking firms in the world. When this war started, China already had 4 months of oil sitting in storage, 4 months during which the Strait of Hormuz could be completely closed, Iranian oil could stop flowing, and China would not run out of fuel. China had prepared, silently, methodically, for years. The U.S. House Select Committee on China released a report during the war documenting exactly how Beijing built that reserve. China used what the committee called a shadow fleet, a network of older oil tankers operating under foreign flags with falsified cargo documents through ship-to-ship transfers off the coasts of Malaysia and Oman, designed to erase the Iranian origin of the crude. These tankers went dark on tracking systems. They switched flags. They received oil from sanctioned Iranian vessels out at sea and brought it to Chinese ports with new paperwork, claiming the oil came from Oman or Russia or Malaysia. This shadow network moved Iranian and Russian sanctioned crude to China more than 1,500 times in a single year, and it delivered that oil at a deep discount, roughly $8 to $10 per barrel below market price, because the sellers were desperate and China was the only willing buyer. China built a 1.4 billion barrel reserve of cheap oil on the backs of sanctions specifically designed to prevent exactly that. And when the war started, China's roughly 150 independent teapot refineries, smaller facilities that process discounted and politically risky crude, were already stocked, already running, already positioned to keep the Chinese economy stable for months. Meanwhile, the rest of Asia was panicking. Japan released 80 million barrels from its strategic reserves, just 15 days of domestic demand. South Korea entered emergency mode. Southeast Asian airlines canceled routes. Pacific nations warned citizens against panic buying. Vietnam restricted fuel consumption. Myanmar restricted private vehicle use to alternate days. China quietly banned fuel exports to conserve supply and sat on its reserves and waited. The double game. Here is where China's position becomes extraordinary. And I want you to understand this clearly because it gets lost in the daily headline cycle. China, during this entire war, has been playing two completely separate games simultaneously. Game one, China is the peacemaker. Wang Yi, China's foreign minister, made 26 phone calls to various parties since February 28th, to Iran, to Israel, to Russia, to the Gulf states, all in the name of ceasefire and dialogue. China and Pakistan co-authored a 5-point peace initiative in late March. Trump himself said, direct quote, "I believe China helped to encourage Iran to agree to the ceasefire." Game two, China is arming Iran. CNN published an exclusive report on April 11th based on U.S. intelligence sources, saying China was preparing to ship shoulder-fired anti-air missile systems, manpads, to Iran through third countries to mask the origin. These are weapons designed to shoot down low-flying aircraft, including American aircraft. The Financial Times reported, based on leaked Iranian documents, that IRGC commanders purchased satellite imagery from Chinese commercial satellite company Emposat, imagery covering American military installations, Prince Sultan Air Base, Muwafaq Salti Air Base, U.S. Fifth Fleet positions. Iranian military commanders were using Chinese satellite data to identify American aircraft and assets. Two games, simultaneously. Peace calls in one hand, weapons pipeline in the other. And the operating principle that makes this possible is a single word: deniability. China sees no real strategic value in overtly entering the conflict, one U.S. intelligence source told CNN. Instead, Beijing is trying to remain a continued friend to Iran, whose oil it heavily depends upon, while maintaining outward neutrality so it can preserve deniability after the war ends. Deniability is not just a tactic, it is a strategy. It is how you fight a war without fighting a war. It is how you shape the outcome of a conflict without ever putting your name on the result. And it is working. Let me give you one more layer of that deniability in action. Trump, when asked by a journalist about U.S. intelligence indicating China was preparing to ship weapons to Iran, said that China would face big problems if it did. Big problems. That is the entire extent of America's public response to the possibility that an allied nuclear power is arming the country America is at war with. Big problems, unspecified, at some undetermined future time. Meanwhile, 4 U.S. government aircraft carrying communications equipment and motorcade support have already landed at Pakistan's Nur Khan Air Force Base, the VIP entry point for Islamabad. The advance team is there. The security is set. America is ready for talks. And Iran's public position is that it has no plans to attend, while its private delegation is already reportedly preparing to travel, both sides performing certainty in public, both sides maintaining optionality in private. both sides watching to see who blinks. China is watching both of them. The fuel crisis nobody covers. I want to step back from the diplomacy and the Islamabad talks for a moment, because there is a story unfolding in parallel that I think matters enormously for the next several years, and it is barely being covered. The world is running out of affordable energy. Because of this war, Qatar, which supplies 12 to 14% of Europe's liquefied natural gas, shut down several gas facilities when Iranian attacks made operations unsafe. 20% of the world's LNG exports disappeared. Europe, already rebuilding energy supply after the 2022 Ukraine crisis, faced another energy shock. Britain is expected to be the worst-hit major economy. Food prices are rising because fertilizer, made from natural gas and exported through the Gulf, has become dramatically more expensive. Vietnam is running on fumes. Myanmar restricted private vehicles to alternate days. Mauritius was days away from running out of oil entirely before emergency supplies arrived from Singapore. Pacific nations that are thousands of miles from this war are watching their fuel reserves drop because a 34-kilometer stretch of water near Iran is closed. And China? China banned its fuel exports to conserve supply. Its teapot refineries kept processing discounted Iranian crude. Its 1.4 billion barrel reserves sat untouched. While the world scrambled, China rationed and waited. There is also something else happening in the fuel crisis that deserves attention. China did not just sit on its reserves passively. China actively managed the situation in ways that served Beijing's interests. On March 5th, major Chinese refiners, Sinopec, Rongsheng Petrochemical, were ordered by the government to stop accepting new fuel export contracts. China, the world's largest refiner of petroleum products, pulled its fuel exports from the global market. This tightened supply worldwide. It kept prices elevated, and it meant that every country trying to find alternative fuel sources had one fewer source available. Was this deliberate economic pressure, or just prudent domestic conservation? The Chinese government said it was conservation. But the effect was the same regardless of intent. Global fuel prices stayed higher. The economic pain on oil-importing nations remained intense, and the pressure on America to resolve the Hormuz situation and therefore make concessions to Iran increased. China did not need to fire a single missile to shape the battlefield. This is not coincidence. This is not luck. This is what years of deliberate strategic preparation look like when they finally get tested. I want to add one more thing to this picture. Something that I think is genuinely undercovered and that connects the fuel crisis to China's strategic position in a way that most analysts haven't fully articulated. China's 150 or so teapot refineries, those smaller independent processing facilities in coastal Chinese provinces, were not just cushioning China from the energy shock. They were actively suppressing the global signal that would have forced a faster resolution. Here's what I mean. When oil prices rise dramatically, the market sends a signal to producers everywhere: increase supply or the price stays high. In a normal energy crisis, high prices create their own pressure for resolution because every party in the conflict feels the pain and wants it to end. But China's teapot refineries, by processing discounted Iranian crude at reduced cost and converting it into refined products, were absorbing a portion of the supply shock that would otherwise have hit the global market harder. They were not resolving the crisis. They were cushioning one economy, China's, from its worst effects while allowing the underlying price pressure to persist everywhere else. Think about what that means in practice. Every Asian country trying to find fuel was competing for a smaller supply pool because China had locked up Iranian crude through long-term shadow fleet arrangements. Every refinery in Japan or South Korea or Singapore that needed medium sour crude, the specific type that Iranian oil is and that not every refinery can process, found less of it available because China had already bought it. China's energy preparation did not just protect China. It shaped the entire texture of the global crisis. And by shaping that texture, it shaped the pressure that fell on America to make a deal quickly. The arithmetic of the ceasefire. Now let me bring this back to the present moment. The ceasefire Pakistan brokered on April 8th 2 weeks of suspended bombing, managed Hormuz, and an attempt to negotiate went to Islamabad on April 11th. Vance, Witkoff, Kushner on one side, Ghalibaf, Araghchi on the other. 21 hours of talks. No deal. The main sticking points: Iran's nuclear program and the Strait of Hormuz. America proposed a 20-year pause on enrichment. Iran countered with 5 years. America rejected 5 years. America wants Hormuz open and free. Iran says it controls the strait and manages it as a strategic instrument. After Islamabad collapsed, America imposed a naval blockade of Iranian ports on April 13th. Iran closed Hormuz again. America seized an Iranian cargo ship, the MV Tuska, 900 feet long, coming from China, on April 19th. Iran vowed retaliation, and now both sides are supposedly heading back to Islamabad for round 2. Iran's public position this morning: no plans for talks as of now. We don't believe in deadlines or ultimatums. Iran's private position, per sources: a delegation may quietly arrive Tuesday. 2 positions, public and private, simultaneously. Notice something about that pattern. We have seen it before. Iran opens airports publicly. Iran keeps Hormuz closed privately. Iran says no talks publicly. Iran sends a delegation privately. China calls for peace publicly. China prepares manpads privately. China condemns the blockade publicly. China buys Iranian oil through shadow tankers privately. Both countries are operating on the same fundamental principle right now. Say one thing in public, do another in private. Maintain deniability. Keep the options open. Never let the other side know exactly what you're willing to accept. This is why the ceasefire is not simply failing or succeeding. It is transforming into something more complex, more layered, more permanent than either side has admitted. What China is positioning for the most important question in this conflict right now is not, will the ceasefire be extended? It is not even, will the war resume? The most important question is, what does the post-war Middle East look like, and who has influence in it? That is what China has been positioning itself to answer since February 28th. Think about what China will walk into the May 14th summit with Trump holding. America has spent, by the Pentagon's own estimate, over $200 billion on this war. American gas prices are approaching $4 to $5 a gallon. Trump's approval ratings are sinking. The war that was supposed to be very close to over in early March is still not over 2 months later. Iran is still standing, still controlling Hormuz, reopening its airports on its own schedule, rebuilding its missile cities during the ceasefire faster than before the war. IRGC commander confirmed that this week. Iran's negotiators say the gaps remain significant. Iran does not believe in deadlines. Now look at China. China spent nothing. China fired nothing. China made 26 diplomatic phone calls, built a 1.4 billion barrel reserve on discounted sanctioned crude, maintained 120 days of energy security while the rest of Asia scrambled, is still buying Iranian oil, is still providing Iran with satellite intelligence, may be providing Iran with weapons, and is about to meet Trump in Beijing, holding the one piece of leverage America actually needs: the ability to pressure Iran into a deal. Because Iran can survive the blockade. Iran can survive the ceasefire expiring, it can rebuild its missiles, it can keep Hormuz closed. The one thing that genuinely pressures Iran toward a deal is economic pain deep enough to matter, and the one country that can deliver or withhold that pressure is China, because China buys 80% of Iran's oil. If China stopped or even reduced significantly, Iran's revenues would collapse. Iran's ability to fund this war and sustain its population would be severely compromised. China knows this, Iran knows this, America knows this, and nobody will say it out loud because saying it out loud changes the game. The real meaning. Let me come back to the title and explain why I chose those 3 specific things. Iran opened flights. Iran closed Hormuz. China opened its reserves. These 3 actions in the same week tell you the entire story of where this conflict stands. Iran opening flights is not a goodwill gesture. It is a controlled signal. It says, we can restore normalcy on our terms, in the sequence we choose, at the pace we determine. Not because you pressured us, because we decided to. We will open the sky when we want to. We will open the sea when we want to, in the order that maximizes our leverage, not yours. Iran closing Hormuz is the other side of that message. The sky is open, the sea is not, because Hormuz is the card, the pressure point, what Iran holds over the entire world's energy supply. And Iran is not releasing that card until it gets what it wants. Lifted sanctions, unfrozen assets, security guarantees, recognition of sovereignty, and the right to continue nuclear enrichment. These are not small asks. They are not positions close to what America is offering. And yet Iran is not walking away from the table entirely, because Iran also knows that if the war fully resumes, the damage to its already battered economy could become unmanageable. So Iran threads a needle. Keep enough pressure on to maintain leverage. Signal enough flexibility to keep talks alive. Open the sky, keep the sea closed, and let China's reserves provide the economic cushion that allows Iran to negotiate from strength. China's reserves in this sense are not just an energy stockpile. They are Iran's lifeline. Every barrel China bought at a discount, every shadow tanker that moved Iranian crude past American sanctions, every teapot refinery that processed that oil into fuel, all of it translated directly into Iranian revenue, Iranian military capability, Iranian resilience. China didn't fight in this war. China funded it, without firing a single shot, without issuing a single declaration, without ever naming a side. That is the most sophisticated strategic play in this conflict, and almost nobody is covering it. Where this goes. The country with the most patience usually gets to write the outcome. That is not an observation I made up. It is what every major great power competition in the last century confirms. America is in a hurry. Gas prices, approval ratings, midterm elections. Trump needs a deal, and he needs it to look like a win. If there's no deal, I would certainly expect fighting to resume. That is not the language of a leader who has time. Iran does not believe in deadlines. That is a direct quote from their foreign ministry spokesperson. They have said it out loud, publicly, on the record. China can wait 120 days just on its reserves alone. That is not counting Russia's continued oil exports to China, not counting the ongoing shadow fleet operations, not counting the leverage Beijing accumulates with every phone call that everyone needs to end this war, and nobody can end without Beijing's help. I am not saying China is going to win something specific. I am saying China has positioned itself so that however this ends, deal, extension, or resumed war, Beijing comes out with more influence in the Middle East than it had on February 27th, while America spent $200 billion, while Iran absorbed the most devastating military campaign against it in decades, while the world's oil markets convulsed. China waited. China is still waiting. China opened its reserves and named no side it chose. Watch Beijing.